Right, so after that horrendously confusing argument, I think things get a little bit more comprehensible, a bit easier to understand. So now we're going to turn, in the last video for this week, is to the second of McTaggart's argument, McTaggart Two. So far we've looked at McTaggart One, and yeah, we've seen premises 1 and 2. His sort of reasons for thinking those were true were comprehensible, maybe false, but comprehensible. The argument for the contradictory nature of the A series, something going on, but very difficult to see what. So okay, that was that argument. Notice then, so McTaggart 2, as we've already seen, we've got this idea, so it still relies upon the same premise 3 there, that the A series is contradictory, but premises 1 and 2 are slightly different here. Rather than saying that for time to occur, moments or to time to occur, change must happen, and for change to occur, then time and events must be ordered in terms of an A series. Here he's saying that for time to exist, changes must occur in a particular direction. So here he's talking about not simply the idea that genuine change involves the A series, but rather that a direction to time involves the A series. So in fact, well, I think I've got, he introduces this, I think I've got a few pictures here, but I think I might move to my drawing pad shortly, but I'll think about that. So there's a metaphor of time's flow, and McTaggart brings this out, and he says, look, you know, it does seem natural to us to think about time in terms of these metaphors, and a pretty good PowerPoint illustration coming up here. He's got this thought that we either think about ourselves as sort of on a boat with, hey, look at that, hey, with time flowing past us, right? So that's the kind of the idea that the river of time, the time just flows past us as we sort of sit. Or we can think alternatively that that time moves forward and we sort of press forward through time. There you are. How about that? Hey, do it again, shall we? Yeah. So the idea that we move forward through time like a boat, or something like that. But either way, what we've got here are two things moving relative to one another, right? If this flow of time is correct. Anyway, the idea is this. He says, on the direction of time, in dealing with the time series, we have not to do merely with the change in an external contemplation of it, but with a change which belongs to the series itself. And this change has a direction of its own. The Great Charter came before the Reform Bill, and the Reform Bill did not come before the Great Charter. Yes. So okay, it seems fairly clear and fairly obvious, and we should be happy with the idea that time has got a direction to it. It flows in a particular direction. Things go from, they start off future, become present, and then become past. They don't start off past, become present, and then go future, or, you know, even more confusingly, start off past, then turn into future, and then become present, or anything like that. Things move in, you know, the flow of time has got a direction. So, okay, McTaggart thinks then, in order to have a direction to time, you're going to need an A series. That is, to organise things in terms of past, present and future. And you might say this, you might say, well, hang on a minute, can't B relations do the job? So, you know, if you imagine the timeline we had laid out, or imagine a timeline laid out, and we had the idea that some events are earlier than other events, and other events are later than others, and right, some are simultaneous with. So World War One is earlier than World War Two, or World War One is before World War Two. And the thought there is, well, hang on, we've got these earlier than and later than relations, so why won't that explain the direction of time, right? You know, some things are earlier than others, other things are later than others. What more do you want? Isn't that a direction? And here's the thought. So McTaggart thinks, no, they can't do the job. And here's why. He thinks that just because we say that one relation is earlier than or one relation is later than, he thinks really there's nothing in the relations themselves which has a direction. And we can think about it like this. Think about the left and the right relation. So here, look at the little illustration. We can say the red dot is to the left of the blue dot is to the left of the green dot is to the left of the yellow dot. Therefore, and the yellow dot is to the right of the green dot, to the right of the blue dot, to the right of the red dot. Therefore, haven't we got a direction here? Because we've got the left of, the right of. So things are flowing here, are they? Or not? Or, there's a thought here. Isn't this just the same as the earlier than and later than relations? We've got a left of and a right of relation. Does it give us a flow? A spatial flow? The thought here is, well, no, it doesn't. And in fact, you can illustrate this by noticing that it's just a matter of perspective. If you're looking at it from the other way around, then in fact the things are reversed. Now, from that direction, the yellow dot is to the left of the green dot, is to the left of the blue dot, and so on. So, right, there's no intrinsic direction to the left of and the right of relations, and McTaggart basically thinks, and that's the same with regard to the earlier than and later than relations. And here we have to introduce this notion of what he calls the C series. So, in actual fact, when we described the B series earlier, and we said it's got these earlier than and later than relations in it, McTaggart thinks that we've got no right to call those earlier than and later than relations unless we've got an A series as well, right? So, unless we can organise time both in terms of the A series and the B series, his thought is, actually, we can't really think of the relations. If time is just organised according to a B series, we can't really think of the relations as being temporal, he thinks, because they haven't got a direction to them. They're just a kind of earlier than, later than. Well, we could reverse those and call them. We could say World War I is later than World War II, and it doesn't really. I'm not really putting this very well. Basically, we should say this. We should, if we haven't got the A series, so we haven't got a flow to time, McTaggart thinks we should really just stick to saying things like World War II is to the left on the timeline of World War I is to the left on the timeline of World War II. He thinks we should stick to things like that. Right? Anyway, he calls this the C series. So the C series is like the B series if we take away the A series. So, yeah, to get true time, then what we need is a C series and an A series, and then what we get is the B series relations of earlier than and later than. I hope that makes some kind of a sense. I do find it quite difficult, by the way, to explain some of these notions without an audience, without a kind of people feeding back to me. But I hope that makes some kind of a sense. Let me say it one more time just to be clear. So what we can do is we can draw a timeline and organise things in terms of, say, the left of and the right of relation. World War I is to the left of World War II. The Queen's coronation is to the right of World War II. Right, we can say that. But notice left of and right of on the timeline, left of and right of aren't really proper, genuine temporal relations. Imagine a God's eye view looking down, you just see them all laid out there. It's not true temporal relations, is the thought. And then we have the A series, and then we can suddenly arrange things in terms of, well, this is past, that is present, and things change. And, things are going to change in a particular direction. Think about a sort of a blob moving along the timeline with everything before the blob being past, everything in front of the blob being future, and where the blob is the present moment. As that moves, it's going to move down the timeline in a particular direction. And then, thinks McTaggart, once we've got that, so we've got what we call the C series with the left of and the right of relations. Now we've got the A series added in. Then McTaggart thinks, now we've got a B series because we're entitled to call the left of and the right of relations an earlier than and later than. They get their temporal meaning from the fact that we've added the A series to the C series. I hope that makes some sense. Okay, so, response to McTaggart Two. If we just go back to the argument briefly, we've already seen premise 3, and right, we're not going to talk about that one again. And I think he's probably right here that time must have a direction. It does have a direction. It's unclear whether we have to have an A series to give an account for this direction. But let's suppose that this argument broadly works, that, I mean, forget the time to exist. Suppose for changes occur in a particular direction, and suppose we kind of agree with the argument, more or less. We think that it all kind of works out. Well, have we got to agree with this conclusion that time does not exist? And that's what I want to question, really, and I'll try and explain why. So there's an analogy I use in the book, this analogy with the perception of colour perception. So there's a view called naive realism about the colours, and that's just the view that colour properties are just out there in the world. So, you know, as we see them, green as I see it is in the cup that I'm looking at. Brown as I see it is in the cupboard that I'm looking at. Like the colours are kind of out there in the world and they impinge upon our senses. Now that view is, I think, fairly obviously naive. It's silly to think that colours exist independently, you know, as we see them, exist independently of our perceptions of them. You know, the blueness of the cup doesn't exist independently of me. The actual kind of blue phenomenological experience, that is. But there is something in the cup. There is a certain property of reflecting light waves at a particular wavelength, and we see that as being blue or green or whatever it might be. Okay, so suppose that we learn that that's so. So we come to see that in fact colours as we see them don't exist in the things out there in the world. Rather, what exists is some physical property which we react to by, as it were, seeing that as having a particular kind of experiential quality, the blueness of blue. Right? Well, what do we say when we learn that? You know, suppose we're naive. We're naive about the colour. We think they're out there in the world, and then we learn, well, in actual fact, colours are just light reflectance properties, and they're not as we see them. Well, we could draw the conclusion, well, colour doesn't really exist after all, right? We could say, well, blue doesn't really exist. There is no real blue out there in the world. We could say that. But we could draw a different conclusion. We could say, well, it turns out then that colours are not as we thought they were. Blue exists, all right, and green exists, and all the colours exist. It's just they are not these phenomenal properties instantiated in the object. Rather, they are the colour reflectance properties, right? So, you know, there's two ways we could go with that. If we move from naive realism to a more sophisticated view, we could either say that colours don't exist, or we could say they do exist, it's just not as we naively thought them to be. And my thought here is perhaps there is a similar response here to McTaggart's argument. It's like, even if it works, well, alright, it's going to mean that time doesn't really have a flow to it, right? So imagine we've only got like a B series with time laid out from earlier than to later than, but we've got no A series, so we've got no movement of time. I mean, suppose McTaggart's right that the A series is contradictory and we can't have such a thing. Well, okay, that's all fine, but the two things we can say, we can either therefore say, well, time doesn't exist because there's no flow, there's no direction. That's one thing we could say. Or what about the alternative conclusion and say, okay, well, time does exist, it's this kind of a static block in a way. It's not as we naively thought it was. It doesn't really have a flow to it. And in fact, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, I think that's probably the correct conclusion to draw. So I do in fact think that there is something to McTaggart's argument about the contradictory nature of the A series, and we'll come back to it in next week when we talk about the A theory and the B theory, and we'll see, I think, that we can actually make something of McTaggart's really confusing argument after all. So okay, next week we're going to be moving on to the A theory and the B theory, which are should be clear, are named after these kind of or McTaggart's distinction between A properties and B properties. Just to sort of introduce this, or to look ahead. So the people who believe the A theory believe that there really is some flow to time, that the metaphors that we give of the passage of time and time being like a river, there is some truth to them. B theorists, however, they deny this. They think that the universe is a kind of, in a sense, a static block. It's all just out there, laid down. So I think the B theorists draw the conclusion that I just drew from McTaggart's argument. They want to say, yeah, McTaggart's argument, there's something in it. There's something dodgy about the A series. I don't think the A series can really exist, thinks the B theorist. But that doesn't mean that time doesn't exist. It means that time is not as we thought it was. Okay, so we're moving on to that next week. Thanks.